Aloha again. This is Neil Erickson coming to you from the Big Island of Hawaii. And I'm happy to introduce our next clinician um, who has been working for the Boston Railway, but prior to that, or excuse me, Boston Commuter Rail, right? But has done a lot of things, including modeling in ON2, currently working on, I believe you said, the New Haven Railroad, right? And
Right.
yeah. And so please welcome Peter Watson talking about signals today, a man who probably knows a lot more than I ever will. Thank you, Peter.
Oh, you're welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. Today we are going to be talking about signals for model railroaders. Not so much how to put a system together or what makes them tick or anything like that, but more what do the signals mean? Model railroaders have been modeling signals for a long time. I can remember back in the late 50s, early 60s, my father put a signaling system on his railroad. Pretty simple. It was basically a single head with the red, green, and yellow lights on it. When a train passed the signal, it turned red. When it passed the next signal down, that first signal would turn yellow. And then finally, when it got into the third block ahead, the first one would turn green and the second one would turn yellow. Pretty simple, but for back then, it was pretty amazing stuff. We had no computers, no JMRI or DCC or CATs. These were all controlled simply by using relays. But it worked and it looked pretty cool. Fast forward now, going up into the late 90s, early 2000s, I had done a stint with the fire department, retired from there and went to work for the railroad, and had to start learning the signals. It was part of the job. I remember before that looking at some of the signal definitions and indications and things and saying, nah, that's too much of a pain. I'm not going to bother with that. It looks nice, but I don't need to use it. Once I went to work for the railroad, obviously I had to use it, so I had to learn them. I was also at that time a member of the hub division here in Boston of the NMRA, and we had a modular layout group that was pretty active. And around 2009, a number of us got together and started talking about how could we implement a signal system on the layout. And by that time, technology had progressed enough that we had DCC, we had JMRI, we had CATs, and those things combined allowed us to contemplate putting in a signal that would actually mimic the prototype. In our area, we use NORAC on the railroad, and so the division took up that and used NORAC for our signaling system. And we developed a plan that allowed us to have Rule 261 territory, which is basically track signaled in both directions. And we used the NORAC signals, and we had a few other things too that we added in there. But the main thing is we got a signal system going, and we have further refined it until we're at the point now where we have a pretty good signal system running. However, in doing that, we had to do some thinking about what did signals mean for model railroaders. I didn't really expect that most modelers would be using signals the way I used them as an engineer, but it's nice to have some idea as to what is involved with signals and what the different signals look like and what they mean. So that's what this clinic is going to be all about. We're going to take a look at what the signals are used for, but more what they look like and what the different different aspects mean. So why are signals needed? First thing is because of time. And I don't mean, what time is it? I'm talking about the amount of time taken for a train to stop. It can take even a medium-sized train a mile or more to stop. Bigger trains take more space than shorter trains. Even a commuter train that I was driving, which is 5 or 6 cars at 60 miles an hour, can take a half a mile to stop. So they don't stop easily or quickly. And we need to be able to make sure that there's enough space between us and other trains around that we can stop without going bump. They're also used for traffic control. Think about an intersection when you're driving the car. You come up to a crossroad. We generally have either stop signs or traffic lights to control how traffic flows through those, so that not everybody tries to go through at the same time. And it's the same thing with the trains, only it's a lot more important because of the amount of time that trains take to go through there. So we use them at interlockings. And again, an interlocking, you can think of that as kind of like an intersection. And they're also used to maintain train spacing on the main line. In between interlockings, you'll frequently find what we call automatic block signals, which are like the signals that my father put on the layout way back when. They're green, yellow, or red. And that tells you that you've got a clear track ahead for 1 or 2 blocks, depending on the color. And if there's something blocking the track up ahead, you're going to start getting a signal downgrade that gives you enough time to bring your train to a stop before you hit something. Where are they used? At interlockings. We talked about that a little bit. They're also used at control points. And a control point is just some place where the dispatcher needs to be able to put a stop signal up to control trains' access to different things. It could be at the entrance to Form D territory, so that he can stop the train before the train enters Form D territory and make sure that the train has the necessary Form Ds and other paperwork that he needs. It could be at the entrance to a movable bridge, like a drawbridge. Any place where the dispatcher needs to be able to control the train. And along the main line, as we mentioned in the previous slide, for controlling the spacing between the trains. So a little bit of let's see. Am I still sharing?
Yes, sir.
Okay. A little bit of definitions are necessary.
Yep, looks good from here.
Okay, leave that other thing alone. All right, so definitions. Interlocking. An interlocking is an interconnection of signals and signal appliances such that their movements must succeed each other in a predetermined sequence, assuring that signals cannot be displayed simultaneously on conflicting routes. This is your rule book definition of it. And basically what that's saying is that at an interlocking, things have to be controlled to the point where we can't possibly send 2 trains on the same track at the same time or across different tracks where they might meet at the same time. Now think about the old interlocking towers where you had banks of levers and the operators up there had to pull these levers. And those levers were connected to switches, they were connected to locks, and they were connected to signals. And to line a route through the interlocking, the signal operator would have to first set up signals that would stop any opposing movements. Then he could throw the switches, then he could lock the switches, and then he could set the signals for the train that was going through the particular route that he was setting up. And while that route was set up and those signals were displayed, nothing else could be directed into that area. So, and interlockings, again, they can be simple, like we show here, a simple crossover. It could be at a terminal area, like such as a station, or it could be a drawbridge. Those are all examples of interlockings. Home signals are the signals that control the entrance into an interlocking.
It's Pennsylvania.
Hello? The westbound home signal is over here. This is the eastbound home signal, and those are the signals that control the entrances into the interlocking. Before you get to the interlocking, you need to have some indication that the signal ahead of you might have changed, and those are done with the distance signal. A distance signal is a fixed signal used to govern the approach of a train to a home signal, so that if, for instance, we're on track here, and we're going to come down and we're going to divert over to the track over there, then we would have to have a signal before we get to the interlocking that tells us that the interlocking signal is going to be something other than a clear, so that we're down to the proper speed for it. And then outside of that, we have the automatic lock signals that are in between interlockings. And these have no control by the dispatcher. They're simply set up to make sure that trains keep their proper spacing. Signals are defined in the rule book. There is NORAC, and if you're interested in downloading a copy of the current 11th edition, you can go to www.cottonvalley.org and go to the safety tab on that site, and you'll get to a page where you can download the NORAC rules. There's also general code, and CSX also in our area has their own set of rules. There's probably others around the country, but like I said, the MBTA uses NORAC. Any trains of ours that run on CSX territory have to use the CSX rule book while we're on their territory. General code doesn't really get used too much by us around here. It's the 11th edition. And NORAC stands for the Northeast Operating Rules Advisory Committee. And this is a group of railroads that got together back 11 editions ago. And at that time, rules were kind of scattered across the different railroads. They all had their own rules, own definitions of things. And they got together to try to find some commonality. And they came up with the 11th edition. Or back then, whatever the edition was. These are the different railroads that are part of the NORAC, and you can see there's quite a list of them there. Amtrak's on there. Keolis down here, who is the current operator of the Boston Commuter Rail, is part of it. Four River Railroad is in our area. Pan Am Railways is part of it. There's a whole bunch of them there, and they are the ones that meet periodically to review and update these rules. Kinds of signals. There's a control signal, and this is one that the dispatcher can control up to a point. He can set it to stop, so that if he needs to stop you before you go into an interlocking for some reason, or before you go into a, say, Form D territory, he can set the signal to stop, and you would have to stop. He can also set it to a permissive aspect, although he does not control which aspect are displayed. He can only say, go or no go. And then there's the automatic signals, which again, those are the ABS signals that we have along the main line in between interlockings. Let's talk a little bit about what information do the signals convey. They convey information as to what's on the track ahead of you. Pretty important to know. If you've got a track or a train in the block ahead of you, it's good to know that, and you need to control your speed accordingly. So signals help to give us that information. When we approach an interlocking, it can tell us which route we're going to take. Are we going straight, or are we going to divert? And they also will tell us what the speed allowable is. And this can be a little confusing. I know when we started doing signaling on the modular group, we had some folks that thought they should use a signal if they wanted to slow a train down out along the main line for some reason. And that's not really what we're talking about here. When I'm running a train out along the main line, I have to know the speeds on that. Kind of like the riverboat captains used to have to know all the ins and outs of all the river that they were negotiating. Well, engineers and conductors have to know the same thing with the route that they're on. You have to know where the switches are. You have to know where the sidings, interlockings are. You have to know what the speeds along those routes are. And that's all found in the timetable, the employee timetable. And here's an example of one here. This is part of the timetable for commuter rail between Boston and Plymouth. And if we look up here, it says locations and speeds shown in normal type are maximum authorized speeds. Also can be abbreviated, you may see it MAS. Locations and speeds shown in bold type are speed restrictions. So if we look down here at the first line, the speed between Pearl, which is an interlocking in Braintree, and the end of the line down at Plymouth is 70 miles an hour. And so that's the maximum authorized speed along that section of track. However, that's not the only speed along there. So the next line down shows that between Pearl, interlocking, and milepost 12, the speed is only 40 miles an hour. Now there's no sign or no signal that's going to tell me that. I have to know that. We go a little bit further south between milepost 12 and milepost 12.72. If you're heading northbound, the speed is 55. And for both directions, between milepost 12.38 and milepost 13.7, the speed is 60, and so on down the line. So these are things that we have to know. The signals will give us speeds when we're going through interlockings or at other control points, but not necessarily along the whole line. All right, so what other information do these signals convey? When you read a signal, you're reading it from the top down. This is a three-headed signal, and if we look at it, the high-speed route is generally governed by the top head, and generally high speed, we're talking about speeds in excess of 45 miles an hour. The middle head is the medium speed route, and medium speed is defined in the rule book as 30 miles an hour in most cases. And low speed is the bottom head, and those are 15-mile-an-hour routes. And then we have colors also. If we see green, that means that the next two blocks are clear. At least the next two blocks, might be the next 5 blocks, but we know for sure that the next 2 blocks are going to be clear on the route that we're on. If we see yellow, it means that only 1 block beyond the signal is clear. The route beyond that is blocked by something. It could be another train or could be a stop signal, but whatever it is on this particular route, yellow, we're only good for 1 more block. And then the third color, red, means exactly what it says. The route is not passable. Stop. So here's a stop signal. And if we're coming along and we see this signal, well, first of all, before we get to this signal, we would have had another signal back behind us that has alerted us to the fact that this signal is going to be all red. And it means just exactly what it's saying. Everything's red. Don't go beyond this signal. And there's really only 2 ways we can get beyond this signal. And one is if the signal changes and give us a more favorable indication, or 2, if the dispatcher gives us verbal permission to pass the stop signal. And that's a very prescribed way of doing that. He would have to talk to the train engineer or the conductor and give them permission to pass the stop signal. And they call out the train, say, train 281, you have permission to pass the stop signal on track 1 at Pearl interlocking and proceed south to track 1. And then the engineer would repeat it back to him in the same form. And then when that's done, then the dispatcher would say, okay, you're okay to go. But those are really the only 2 ways you can go by a stop signal. Here's some different indications of stop signals. They're all basically the same. They all red, no other colors. And it, depending on what the track conditions are, would depend on what type of signal you'd see. Over here, we have a signal with 3 heads. It means that it's somewhere along the way in there. That signal needs to be able to convey slow speed indications. The middle one needs to be able to convey only medium and full speed indications, etc. Now, before we move too much further on, we've got to talk a little bit about restricted speed, because when we get that permission to pass the stop signal verbally from the dispatcher that we just saw, and he gives us that verbal permission, after you go by that signal, you can only operate at restricted speed. And this is a very important rule in the rule book. In NORAC, it's Rule 80. movement at restricted speed. And movements made at restricted speed must comply with the following requirements. Controlling the movement must be controlled to permit stopping within 1/2 the range of vision, short of other trains or railroad equipment occupying or fouling the track. Obstructions on or fouling the track, switches not properly lined for movement. In other words, if you're coming up upon a switch and it's not lined for the route that you're supposed to be taking, particularly if it's a trailing point switch, you better not go through it or you're going to own it. Derail set in the derailing position. Employees working in foul of the track. And when I first started working for the railroad, I was with Amtrak, and they were hiring a lot of conductors for the work electrifying the line between Boston and New Haven. And every contractor out there that was working on that electrification project, if he was anywhere close to the track, had to have a conductor with him to make sure that they weren't fouling the track when trains came by. So if you're working at restricted speed, that would be the kind of thing where you might see employees out there near the track. And then, of course, the end of the track. We don't want to run off the end of the track. Any signal requiring stop. So those are all things that you have to be watching for. In addition to those, you have to be vigilant. Employees controlling or directing a movement at restricted speed must be on the lookout for broken rail and misaligned track, and have to control the speed of the movement so that if you're outside of an interlocking, you can't exceed 20 miles an hour, and within the interlocking limits, you have to keep it down to 15 miles an hour. And this restriction applies to the entire movement unless otherwise specified in the rule or instruction that requires restricted speed. So the next signal we're going to look at is a stop and proceed. Now, if you look at this, it looks pretty much like the stop signal with one exception. We have this sign down here. And that indicates that it is not a stop signal, it is a stop and proceed signal. And the numbers in that sign typically are the milepost that the signal is located at. So if the signal is at milepost 43.5, that would be the number that you're seeing in that sign. And what this signal tells us is to stop. Then you can proceed at restricted speed until the entire train has cleared all interlocking and spring switches, and the leading wheels have passed a more favorable fixed signal or entered non-signal DCS territory. DCS is a Form D territory. This can be modified by the individual railroads in their rules and in the timetable. And in fact, the MBTA used to change this so that number one passed a more favorable fixed signal. Back that up just a little bit. The leading wheels, the MBTA had it so that the entire train has to pass a more favorable signal or enter non-signal DCS territory. Different railroads will have different requirements, but in general, the way the rule reads, unless they've made that change, is that the leading wheels. In cab signal territory, trains with operative cab signals must not increase their speed until they have run one train length or 500 feet, whichever is greater, past a location where a more favorable cab signal was received. And here's some examples of stop and proceed signals. Now, if you take a look at this one here, there's no light showing there. And this is probably a good place to point out that there is another rule called that deals with imperfectly displayed or missing signals. And basically it says if the signal is not displayed properly, or it's imperfectly displayed, or if there's a light out, then you have to treat the signal as though with the most restricting aspect that the signal could display. So if we look at this one, and this is a signal that you might see in certain territories, the most restricting signal that this could display would be a stop or stop and proceed. So that's how that would be treated. The variation of the stop and proceed has this G sign on it. It means the same as the others. Stop, then proceed at restricted speed until the entire train has cleared all interlocking, etc., etc. But it has this G symbol on it, and we're identified by special instruction or where the letter G grade marker or R for restricting marker is displayed in addition to the number plate. As part of these aspects, the freight trains may observe the signal as though a restricting rule 290 were displayed. And basically what's that's for so that a train, a heavy freight train, does not have to stop on a grade. Might not get going again. So in those cases where that letter is displayed on there, the train can come down and be doing restricted speed when he passes that signal and keep on going so that he doesn't have to come to a complete stop. Again, in cab signal territory, you have to run one train length or grade past the location where more favorable cab signal was received. For model railroaders and for railroaders, we can use this saying here, and it's one that's taught to us as railroaders. If it's not all red, it's not red at all. So if we look at this restricting signal, we have the signal is showing some color here, so we know that that's not all red. And these two signals up here that are displaying the red, really that red is just being used as a placeholder so that we know that those lights on that head are not out. So a restricting signal means what the restricting rule that we just looked at said: restricted speed until the entire train has cleared all interlocking and spring switches. If the signal is an interlocking and the leading wheels have passed a more favorable signal or entered non-signal DCS territory. And then here's some variations on it. You'll notice that some of these are showing white. Actually, it's called Luna white. This is proceed again at restricted speed, and on some railroads they use a Luna white in this particular application. Not all railroads, and if it's a railroad that you're working on, you would know what it would be in your rule book. Next signal we're going to talk about is clear. And if we look at this signal, we're up here. If we go back to that slide a few slides ago that told us what the signals meant, we're up here on the high-speed route. We have a clear signal. The green light indicates that the next two blocks ahead are clear. On any other routes that we have, medium or slow-speed routes, they are not passable. So proceed not exceeding normal speed, and as I mentioned, it can also be abbreviated as MAS, maximum authorized speed. Some variations on the clear signal. In some cases, you may see a double green, or it may just be green over red. And in this case here, the only signal that this could be would be another clear signal because there is no green over yellow. Cab speed, it's a variation on the clear signal. And that's indicated by the flashing green light. And this one tells us to proceed in accordance with cab signal indication. Reduce speed to not exceeding 60 miles an hour if cab signal is displayed without a signal speed, or if cab signals are not operative. Engines with cab speed units or ADUs in them will show what the signal is, that information is conveyed to the ADU through the rail. And some of them also have a speed in miles per hour on them. So if you're on a track that's say 80 mile an hour maximum speed, and the ADU says 60, and you have this cab speed signal showing, then you would have to reduce to 60 miles an hour. If it's at 40, you'd have to reduce to 40. On ADUs without that speed indication, you have to reduce speed so that you're not going any faster than 60. And this is some other signals that you might see this indication on. Next signal, approach limited. And here's a case where we have the top signal is yellow, so it's telling us that we have, on that line, we have a clear track, only 1 block ahead. And on the medium speed, or in this case, limited speed route, we're clear for 2 blocks ahead. So we can change that signal, make it flashing, and go from a 30-mile-an-hour signal, which is what the signal head in this area is, up to a 45-mile-an-hour route. So this is telling us proceed approaching the next signal at limited speed. And we have to be down to 45 miles an hour, which is what limited speed is, by the time we get to the next signal. Some of the other approach limited signals that you might see out there. And if the approach limited is telling us to be down to 45, then probably this is what you're going to see at the next signal. And this is a limited clear. And what this means is proceed at limited speed until the entire train clears all interlocking or spring switches, and then you can proceed at normal speed. So we know by the green light that the next 2 blocks ahead at least are clear. And the limiting factor here is the fact that we're diverting from the route that we're on to a different route. And the speed, maximum speed through that set of switches is going to be 45. In cab signal territory with fixed automatic block signals, trains not equipped with operative cab signals must approach the next signal at limited speed as well. And some other variations. Just you should probably take a minute here to talk about these dwarf signals. There's 2 types of dwarf signals that we see here. One of them has lights stacked up on top of each other, but each one would be a series of 3. So if we look at this one on the left, the top 3 would be one light and the bottom 3 would be the other light, and each particular unit has its own lens. If we go over to the other 2, the lights each have a series of lenses in front of them so that they can be changed to whatever color is needed for that. Okay, approach medium. Rule 282. Proceed approaching the next signal at medium speed. And this is some of the other signals that you might see that same indication on. And again, the top signal is telling us that the track we're on is only clear for 1 block ahead. After that, it's not passable. And the medium speed route is passable for at least 2 blocks. Medium clear would be the normal signal that you would see after that. And like the other one that we were looking at, the limited clear, it's basically the same thing, except that the speed is only 30. So proceed at medium speed until the entire train clears all interlocking and spring switches, then proceed at normal speed. And in cab signal territory, approach the next signal at medium speed. Some other variations on that. Advanced approach, sometimes you're in a situation where signals are spaced close enough together that you don't have enough room to get down to the proper speed. So advanced approach is used. And this is a blinking yellow light on the top head. And it means proceed prepared to stop at the second signal. Trains exceeding limited speed must begin reduction to limited speed as soon as the engine passes the advanced approach signal. And again, it's to get you down to the proper speed that you need by the time you hit the stop signal that's probably coming up. Medium approach medium. Proceed at medium speed until the entire train clears all interlocking or spring switches, then proceed approaching the next signal at medium speed. So in this case, you're going to go through an interlocking at medium speed You would have had another signal before you got there telling you to be down to medium speed, and then approach the next signal at medium speed. If you have not got that signal to tell you to slow down to medium by the time you get here, and you are exceeding medium speed, trains exceeding medium speed must begin reduction to medium speed as soon as the medium approach medium signal is clearly visible. Medium approach slow, proceed at medium speed, then approach the next signal at slow speed. Approach slow. Kind of looks like the last one, except the signals are flip-flopped on us. Proceed approaching the next signal at slow speed. Trains exceeding medium speed must begin reduction to medium speed as soon as the engine passes the approach slow signal. So it's similar to the approach signal, but we have to be down to medium to slow speed by the next signal. And these are some other variations. Approach. This is a very common one that you're going to see. And if you're coming up to an interlocking with a stop signal at it, this is going to be the distance signal. Proceed prepared to stop at the next signal. Trains exceeding medium speed must begin reduction to medium speed as soon as the engine passes the approach signal. Depending on where you are and what part of the railroad you were on and how your railroad's set up, this signal could be a mile or more away from the signal that requires stop. So it's not like you're going to run into that stop signal right away. If it was a lot closer, you might get the advance approach instead. But so if you're doing 60 miles an hour or 70 miles an hour, once you go by that approach signal, then you have to start putting on the brakes to get yourself down so that you can stop by the time you get it to the next signal. Some other variations. And that one over on the right, the Dwarf signal, is new to NORAC 11. For a long time, there was no approach signal with Dwarfs, and they have added it with this edition of NORAC. Medium approach. Proceed to stop at the next signal. Trains exceeding medium speed must begin reduction to medium speed as soon as the medium approach signal is clearly visible, as opposed to the approach signal. So this one, as soon as you see it, you need to start coming down to medium speed so that you're down to it by the time you go by, and then be prepared to stop at the next signal. Some other variations. Limited approach is basically the same thing, except that it's going to proceed prepared to stop at the next signal. Limited speed applies to through all interlocking or spring switches, then medium speed applies. Trains exceeding limited speed must begin reduction as soon as the limited approach signal is clearly visible. Slow clear. Proceed at slow speed until the entire train clears all interlocking and spring switches, then proceed at normal speed. This would be, for instance, through an interlocking where the track configuration requires only 15 miles an hour. Slow clear. Some other variations. Slow approach. Proceed prepared to stop at the next signal. Slow speed applies until the entire train clears all interlocking and spring switches, then medium speed applies. But you still have to be prepared to stop at the next signal. And basically what these are telling us is that the interlocking may require only 15 miles an hour. But once you get through the interlocking, the next signal may be, further down the track, and they want to keep the trains moving. So they let you pick your speed up a little bit. And then coming up to the end, we're going to talk a little bit about color position and position signals. The color light signals, which are the ones that we've been dealing with, are on the left, and the position color light and position light signals are the other two. And all three of these mean the same thing. They're all showing a clear indication. If you think of a conductor giving a proceed indication to in hand signals to the engineer, he's moving his hand or his lantern up and down, and that's kind of a way to look at these signals here. They're in a vertical orientation, so up and down is equivalent to clear. For the approach signal, in the color light would turn to yellow. The position color light uses signal and a diagonal orientation. The position light signal is, the colors don't change, it's always the same colors, but again, you have that slanted aspect. And this is stop. And again, if a conductor is giving a stop signal to an engineer, he's moving his arm or his lantern back and forth horizontally. And that's what those signals kind of replicate. This is what the approach medium signal would look like. So again, you can see that the position and color light signals very clearly are mimicking the color light signal. And once you know how they work, it's pretty easy to make the transition to the position light. Medium clear. These are two websites that you can go to. I mentioned the Cotton Valley one earlier, and the other one, MikeRoke.com, Railroad Signals, has a very good overview of color signals and how they work. And I would highly recommend, if you're interested, to go looking at that website as well. And that brings us to the end. Does anybody have any questions?
Well, for some reason, I keep coming back upside down there. I don't know. Sorry, Peter. There we go. Yeah, you prompted a lot of questions. So
Oh,
if you have a
okay.
moment before we go to the breakout room, let me get my notes here. First of all, I was curious. I think I asked you what NORAC means, but thank you for defining that. Is it similar in other parts of the country? I mean, BNSF, CXX, do they use something similar?
They would have their own set of rules. General code is another set of rules that is used out there. As I mentioned, CSX, I know, has their own rule book. I suspect that UP or BNSF probably have their own rule book. They may be on general code, but they may have their own rule book as well. And what gets confusing is when you are an engineer or a conductor and you're working across multiple roads. For instance, when I leave Boston going out to Worcester, we transition from MBTA territory to CSX territory. And once we get into CSX territory, we have to use the CSX rule book. So any differences, and there's not a lot, but there are some, any differences between the two rule books, we have to forget about the MBTA and go by what the NORAC ones are.
That makes sense. Thank you for that. I was curious, you mentioned Rule 261 and others, by the way, but what is Rule 261?
Rule 261 is a rule in the rule book that says that the track is signaled in both directions.
I see.
There's another one, Rule 251, which is track signaled in one direction. And there's a huge difference there. If you are going in 251 with the flow of traffic, you're all fine and dandy. If for some reason you have to go the other direction, you don't have any signals. And there's a very specific set of rules that cover that. And I'm not going to try to get into that here, but those are the two basic types of track that we have.
Sounds like you could write a book. Actually, there is a book recently published by Kalmbach, I think. Yeah. Dave Abeles. You mentioned a bunch of terminology. For starters, Form D territory. What does that mean?
Form D territory is where you have to have a written piece of paper in order to get into it. NORAC calls it a Form D. Others may call it something else. I think some places call it a Form 19. But it's basically a piece of paper. Most of it's pre-printed and you have to fill in the blanks. But the dispatcher talks to the crew and they fill it out, and it has information such as the train number, the date, the time, the line, and what your authorizations are. And without that, you can't get into Form D territory. And that's a place where you would probably have a signal to stop you from proceeding until the dispatcher knows that you've got the required paperwork.
That makes sense. It reminds me of dark territory, which of course has nothing to do with signals.
But, well, that's exactly what it is. It's also known as dark territory. So
Okay, okay. ABS, absolute block. What did you say that was?
absolute block signals. Those are the ones that are in between interlockings, and they just work all by themselves. It's a single headed signal that displays either clear, approach, or stop and proceed. And it all
Okay.
works automatically.
I'm watching the feed, see if anybody else has any questions. Someone did ask, when you're modeling these, I'm not sure how you guys are doing it, but are you using JMRI? Does that help you program the signal aspects?
Yes. JMRI and in accordance with, or in combination with CADS, is what we use. And quite frankly, I am not the person to be talking about that. We have a number of other guys in our module group that are much better at that than I am. But between the hardware that we use for detecting trains in a particular block and the software, which is JMRI and CATS, those are what we use to do the signals. And they're very good. They allow us to define signals so that we can define what signals are going to be used at any given location. You don't need all of the signals at all locations. You only need a handful. So you'd set the thing up according to that.
So it sounds to me like JMRA can be configured to replicate NORAC, for example, or other systems.
Correct.
Oh, okay, okay, that makes sense. And you didn't talk at all about semaphores. I know this is old school. I'm just curious when railroads changed over, or if some railroads are still using semaphores.
Well, we don't use them around here. I haven't seen them in any use. I know the New Haven used to use them, but hang on just a second here.
I didn't mean to stump you there, but
yeah, you haven't seen them around here. Semaphores around here just pretty much aren't used. So.
Well, I'm anxious to learn more. There is a breakout room. I don't know if you're going to be able to attend over there. The MRL-Aussie, spelled AUSSIES. That's through wereby.com.
Mm-hmm.
And anybody that wants to join and learn more from Peter, I think that would be a good spot. And the last group, frankly, is still going on. And I believe John is still in that group. And if you want to meet our NMRA president, Gordy Robinson, he's there along with others. So,
Okay.
Peter, thank you so much. It's probably more to digest than I have time for.
There's a lot to it, but the main thing is for model railroaders, if it's not red, it's not red at all. We can stop our trains a lot faster than the real ones can. And if you just remember, anything that's all red, stop. If it's showing any color, if it's green, go. If it's yellow, go slow. And if it's red, stop.
When we get into the breakout room, I want to ask you about signals that I see during modern era, at least in the West Coast, where they are dark and everybody keeps moving. And so I wondered if that's a different standard. So, hey, everybody who's had an opportunity to join us, I want to thank Brad Anderson and Gert Speed-Mueller for helping do this. And of course, Gordy Robinson for setting everything up. And Peter, thanks again.
My pleasure.
Back to you, Speed.
Hi, this is Ken Patterson, the host of the What's Neat show over at Model Railroad Hobbyist Magazine and the What's Neat This Week in Model Railroading podcast that you all love to watch every week, keeping you informed of what's new in the hobby and with my great podcast crew. Now, if you like the NMRX content that you're watching, don't forget to hit the like button and or subscribe, and be sure to hit that little bell icon at the bottom so that you are notified of the next show coming up. So rock and roll, guys. Enjoy the rest of this show. How's that? That last one was the best because I got my rock and roll in there.